Hello, this is Todd Hubbs, agricultural economist at the University of Illinois. Today I'm talking about corn and soybean acreage in 2019, and I'm sort of digging into, are we going to start seeing an unwinding of the change in principal crop acreage we've seen since the advent of the renewable fuel standard and the rise in soybean exports to China? I've done a little bit of calculations. Right now, under current commodity prices, I've pegged corn acreage at 91.1 million acres in 2019 and soybean acreage at 85.7. I'm going to talk a little bit today about why I see that happening. In this graph, I'm showing principal crop planted acres, what the USDA calls principal crops, and I've sort of aggregated them together. I've got corn and soybeans there at the first. I took 2006 as a break-off point, and you can see it building and then maybe regressing here a little bit at the end since 2006 in total millions of acres. You see wheat, and this includes spring, winter, and durum wheat. Small grains, this is rye, barley, oats, other type of small grains. I included sunflowers in there, so forgive me for that, and a couple other big categories. But basically what we've seen since 2006 is a building in corn and soybean acreage across large swaths of the country, and a regression in wheat, which is continuing a long process that's been going on for quite a while, and some weakening in small grains depending on where you're at. And where you can really notice this kind of change is in parts of the western corn belt, in particular North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit in the next slides. What you're seeing here is corn acreage by region since 1997. Basically, the eastern corn belts, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania. And then I split the western corn belt into the traditional western corn belt, and then North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas, and then everybody else. And what you can see is pretty stable across the eastern corn belt. A little rise there after the renewable fuel standard. A little bit of growth in other parts of the western corn belt, but a dramatic increase in North Dakota, South Dakota, and Kansas since about 2010, and this has really come at the expense of wheat acreage and some small grains, not all but some, but in particular wheat acreage. And it's really expanded to where we saw a couple years ago corn and soybean acreage was total about 180 million acres. Now, while I see an expansion of corn acreage next year based on the price relationship between corn, soybeans, and other of the principal crops, and a decrease in soybean acreage, I think what we're going to see maybe out in the western corn belt and some other areas is a shift away from soybeans and some corn into wheat, spring wheat in particular, cotton, and some of these other small grain crops, to where we won't see 180 million acres of corn and soybeans next year. Actually, maybe this is an unwinding of this new era of prices we've seen regarding the renewable fuel standard and expanded exports to China for soybeans. Like the previous slide showing corn acreage, this one shows soybean acreage by region since 1997. And what I've done is broken into eastern corn belt, broke up the western corn belt, and then I have the mid-south, which would be Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, that region of the country. Then the southeast is Georgia and Florida, places like that. And then the east coast is some of those smaller states along the east coast. I expect to see much lower soybean acreage this year if we continue into this trade war, which shows no signs of letting up. The relative price of soybeans to some of the other principal crops is much weaker, and we may see particularly strong adjustment in the western corn belt states as they move back into wheat, spring wheat in particular, and some of the other small grains. Expectations about corn and soybean acres will continue to evolve as we move into 2019. Some of the preliminary surveys on planting intentions have placed soybean acreage anywhere from 82.5 to 87 million acres and corn acreage anywhere from 90 to 94 million acres. I'm a little bit on the low end on the corn acres and somewhere right between on the soybean acreage. And a lot of it's going to depend on how supply and demand evolve between now and planting time. The first indication will be the winter wheat seedings report in January, and then we'll get a really strong indication in the March prospective plantings report. So I'd like to thank you for your time. You can find my weekly outlook and daily analysis of issues related to Corn Belt farm economics at farm.daily.illinois.edu.